Good evening, my fellow night dwellers. Tonight I've got something special for you. You know there are jobs out there that seem harmless, routine even, but sometimes behind the ordinary there lurks something far more sinister. Imagine you're working alone in the dead of night in an abandoned place far beneath the surface, and then without warning, you realize you're not alone. Trust me, these are stories that will make you think twice before working that next night shift. We always knew there was something wrong with that old subway tunnel. You'd hear whispers about it from the old timers, stories they'd tell when they had one too many beers after a shift. Most of us didn't believe them. I sure didn't. Not until I saw it for myself. The tunnel had been shut down for years. Decades, maybe. It ran beneath a newer system, deeper underground than any of us had ever worked. Some kind of structural failure had caused the city to close it off, but no one ever gave us a straight answer as to why. All I knew was that last week the city called in for a team to inspect it, see if it was worth reopening. Of course, that team was me and my buddy Tom. We thought it was a routine gig. I mean, we'd done worse before. How bad could an old abandoned tunnel be? Turns out, bad didn't even begin to describe it. We showed up late in the afternoon, flashlights in hand, hard hats on, and descended into the old system. The air was heavy down there, thick with dust and mildew. Every breath felt like it was clogging up my lungs. The walls were covered in grime, and the tracks were rusted to hell. The deeper we went, the darker it got, like the light just didn't want to stick around. Tom cracked a joke about haunted tunnels, trying to lighten the mood, but neither of us laughed. As we walked deeper, the sound of our boots echoed through the tunnel. That was the only noise, just the rhythm of our footsteps and the occasional drip of water from the ceiling. It was cold, too. Colder than it should have been for a subway tunnel. I pulled my jacket tighter, but it didn't help. About 20 minutes in, we reached a section of the tunnel where the tracks veered off into a side passage that wasn't on any of our maps. I stopped, shining my light into the opening. "Tom, you see this? We weren't told about this part." He grunted and came over to check it out. "Must be an old maintenance shaft," he said, "or something they forgot about." I wasn't so sure. It didn't look like a regular shaft. The entrance was almost organic, like the walls had been scraped out by something. But there were no tool marks, no signs that people had been down there in a long time. Still, we had a job to do, so we headed in. And that's when I heard the first sound. It was faint at first, almost like a soft scratching. I stopped, holding up my hand. "Tom, you hear that?" He paused, listening for a second, and then shook his head. "Probably rats. This place is crawling with them." I wasn't convinced. The sound wasn't skittering like claws on concrete. It was different, more deliberate, like something was scraping against metal. We kept walking, the passage narrowing as we went. The walls seemed to close in on us, and the air grew even colder. My breath was visible now, and I felt a shiver crawl up my spine. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I wanted to turn back, but I didn't want to look like a coward, so I kept my mouth shut. And then we heard it again. This time it was louder. The scraping noise echoed through the tunnel, followed by a low growl. I stopped dead in my tracks. "Tom, that's not a rat." He turned to me, his face pale. "No," he said quietly. "No, it's not." We both stood there, listening. The growl grew louder, closer, and then from the darkness ahead something moved. At first, I thought it was a shadow, just the flicker of our lights playing tricks on us. But then it shifted, stepping into the beam of my flashlight. And that's when we saw it. It was a figure. Humanoid, but not human. Its skin was pale, almost translucent, stretched tight over its bones. Its limbs were long and spindly, too long for its body, and its fingers ended in sharp, claw-like nails. But its face... God, its face was the worst part. Its eyes were large and black, sunken deep into its skull, and its mouth was filled with sharp, crooked teeth. It stared at us, unblinking, like it had been waiting for us. For a second, none of us moved. Then it let out another growl, a low, rumbling sound that sent chills down my spine. Before I could react, it lunged. "Run!" I shouted, turning and bolting back the way we came. Tom was right behind me. We sprinted through the narrow passage, the sound of the creature's claws scraping against the walls growing louder with every step. I could hear its breath, hot and ragged, as it chased us. It was fast, too fast. I glanced back and saw it closing in, its limbs moving in jerky, unnatural ways like it wasn't used to running upright. We rounded a corner and I slammed into the side of the tunnel, nearly losing my balance. Tom grabbed my arm, pulling me forward, but I could hear more of them now, not just one, but many. The sound of scraping claws echoed from all directions. We were surrounded. "They're everywhere," Tom shouted, his voice cracking with fear. I didn't respond. I couldn't. My mind was racing, trying to figure a way out, but there was no escape. The tunnel was too narrow and the creatures were closing in fast. Just when I thought it was over, we reached a junction where there were two paths ahead, one leading deeper into the tunnel system and the other back toward the surface. "This way," I shouted, pointing toward the surface, but Tom didn't follow. He stopped, staring at the creatures as they crawled towards us from the darkness. "We'll never make it," he whispered, shaking his head. "They're too fast." "Tom, come on!" I yelled, grabbing his arm, but he wouldn't move. And then they were on us. One of the creatures lunged at Tom, his claws sinking into his leg. He screamed, falling to the ground as it dragged him toward the darkness. I tried to pull him back, but another one grabbed my arm, its claws digging into my flesh. I fought back, kicking and punching, but they were too strong. There were too many of them. Tom's screams echoed through the tunnel as the creatures swarmed over him, their teeth gnawing at him and claws tearing into his flesh. I could see the blood pooling beneath him. I turned and ran, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't look back. I couldn't. All I could hear were the sounds of the creatures, their growls, their claws scraping against the walls, and Tom's screams fading into the distance. I don't know how I made it out of there. By the time I reached the surface, my clothes were torn, my arms and legs were covered in deep scratches, but I was alive. Barely. I tried to tell the others what happened, but they didn't believe me. Said I must have hit my head, imagined the whole thing. They never found Tom's body. They said he must have fallen into a sinkhole, buried beneath the rubble of the tunnel. But I know the truth. Those things are down there, and they took Tom. And that's something that haunts me to this day. We always kind of joked about working at the water treatment plant. I mean, how exciting could it really be? Checking on filtration systems, adjusting pressure gauges, day in and day out, and it was all the same. But that day, the day we went down to inspect those tanks, things changed forever. It was a Tuesday. Me and my buddy Dave had been getting reports of weird water flow disruptions in the lower tanks for the past couple of weeks. Nothing major at first, just a blip here, a drop there, but it started getting worse. The levels were fluctuating like crazy and no one could figure out why. Management told us to check it out, so we grabbed our gear, suited up, and headed down into the depths of the plant. The tanks we were checking weren't your typical backyard pool size. No, these things were massive. The water in them ran deep, deeper than anyone really knew. The plant's been here for decades, and we'd heard stories about the old tunnels beneath the tanks leading to God knows where. Some of the older guys called it the dead zone, but I figured it was just them messing with us. When we got to the first tank, it was quiet. A little too quiet. The only sound was the hum of the machinery and the faint dripping of water echoing through the place. I shot Dave a look and he just shrugged. Typical Dave, always laid back, never worried. I wish I'd been more like that. We started lowering ourselves into the tank, inspecting the pipes and grates all along the walls. Nothing seemed out of place. But the water, something about it felt wrong. You ever get that feeling like something's watching you? Yeah, it was like that. I brushed it off. Just nerves, I thought. After all, this place was a rusty old mess, and the air always felt heavy. But I couldn't shake that feeling. Dave moved ahead of me, diving deeper into the tank system, where it narrowed into a series of smaller connected chambers. The deeper we went, the darker the water got, and I swear it was colder too. We kept our flashlights pointed ahead, but the beams didn't seem to cut through the water like they should have. It was like the darkness was swallowing the light. I don't really know how else to explain it. We were almost at the bottom when I saw something move out of the corner of my eye. Just a flicker, like a shadow darting past. But I froze. Dave, did you see that? He turned, shining his light over at me, looking annoyed. See what, man? You're paranoid. Something moved. I'm serious. I think there's something in here. Dave laughed. It's probably just a fish or some debris. This place is falling apart. But I wasn't so sure. Something in my gut told me otherwise. I kept looking around, trying to calm myself down, but that's when it happened. The water rippled, fast. Too fast. Something big was moving underneath us, and it wasn't debris. Before I could say anything, something grabbed Dave's leg. I saw his body jerk downward, his flashlight spinning out of his hand as he was yanked under the water. His scream was muffled by the rushing bubbles, and I lunged for him, grabbed onto his arm, but whatever had him was stronger than any fish or current. I yelled at him to hold on, trying to pull him back up, but he was thrashing, panicking. I barely held on. His face was wild with fear, and I'll never forget the look in his eyes. And then I saw it. Beneath him, coiling through the murky water, was something long, like an eel, but bigger, much bigger. It wrapped around his legs, pulling him further down. Its skin was slick and black, almost blending into the darkness. But the size of it, this thing was massive. Dave kicked and punched at it, but the creature tightened its grip. I kept pulling, but it was no use. I could feel my own strength fading as whatever it was dragged him deeper. Then, another one appeared, slithering up from the depths, and then another. There were more of them. These things weren't just eels, they were something worse. Mutated, twisted. Their eyes glowed faintly, watching us with a terrifying intelligence, like they knew exactly what they were doing. "Get it off me," Dave screamed, his voice ragged and desperate. I tried. God, I tried. But they were everywhere now, circling us like they were hunting. I could feel the water pulsing around me, the currents shifting with their movements. I had to let go, or they were going to pull me down too. "Dave, I'm sorry," I shouted, my voice breaking, but I had no choice. I let him go. His screams echoed as eels dragged him deeper into the dark, their bodies twisting around him like constrictors. I watched helpless as he disappeared below the waterline, his flashlight still flickering from the depths. And then there was nothing, just the quiet hum of the plant and the eerie stillness of the water. I should have left, should have climbed out right then and there, but I couldn't leave him. I couldn't let those things get away with it. I needed to know what was down there, what had done this. So I dove, deeper than I'd ever gone. The water got colder and the pressure built, but I kept going. The beams from my flashlight barely cut through the murk now. My heart was pounding, every beat louder than the last. I felt like I was suffocating, but I kept moving. And that's when I saw the nest. There at the bottom of the tank, hidden in the deepest part, were the eels. Dozens of them. Their bodies tangled together, writhing, pulsing. And in the middle of it all, something worse. The source. It was a massive pipe, corroded and leaking. Thick black chemicals were seeping into the water and the eels were feeding off of it. Mutating, growing. I understood now the chemicals. They'd changed them, made them smarter, deadlier. I barely had time to process it when I felt something brush up against my leg. I turned and there it was, one of the eels. Its glowing eyes locked onto mine. I kicked at it trying to swim back up, but it was too fast. It lunged, wrapping itself around my waist. Its body was cold and slimy, tightening with every second. I fought against it, my lungs burning, my vision starting to blur. I could feel it pulling me down, dragging me towards the nest. I thought I was dead. But then a jolt. The pressure around my waist loosened just for a second, and I kicked with everything I had. My hand found a rusted metal grate and I pulled myself free. The eel let out this shrill hiss, and I could see the others coming for me. I swam faster than I ever had in my life, kicking and clawing my way back to the surface. My lungs screamed for air, my body aching, but I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. When I finally broke the surface, I gasped, choking on the cold air. I scrambled out of the tank, collapsing onto the concrete floor, shivering and soaked. They didn't follow me. For whatever reason, they stayed down there in their dark, twisted world. I never told anyone what I saw. I knew they wouldn't believe me. Dave's disappearance was labeled as an accident, another casualty of the job. But I know the truth. Those things are still down there, waiting, growing. I just fear for the next guy that finds them down there. Or should I say the next guy that they find down there? Working the night shift as a janitor wasn't exactly a dream job, but it paid the bills. Me and Ray, we had the run of the place at night, and in an old medical research facility like this one, it could get pretty eerie. The halls were always too quiet and the lights flickered just a little too often for my liking. But you get used to it after a while. At least that's what I kept telling myself, anyway. That night, the call came in around 11 p.m. Our supervisor, Ted, radioed in, telling us we had a special assignment. They needed us to clean out some old containment room down in the lower levels. The place had been sealed off for years, so no one had been in there for a long time. I didn't ask questions. Ray didn't either. We'd done plenty of weird jobs before, and this didn't seem any different. Just another part of the building that was off limits until it wasn't. Ted handed us the keys and gave us one of those be careful looks before heading off. I should have known something was wrong when he didn't offer to come with us. Ted was usually the type who'd supervise every little thing, even if it was just mopping a floor. But this time he didn't say a word. He just gave us the keys and left. The elevator ride down felt longer than usual. The lower levels weren't used much anymore. Most of the labs had been moved to newer buildings across town, but this one still held some of the old research projects, ones they didn't like to talk about. Ray was quiet, which wasn't like him. Usually he'd be cracking jokes or complaining about the job, but that night he just stared at the walls, looking uneasy. "Place gives me the creeps," he whispered as the elevator door slid open. I couldn't disagree. The hallway in front of us was cold and dark. Our footsteps echoed off the walls, and the air felt damp, like the place had been sealed off for too long. We found the room easily enough. Room 131, containment area. There were no windows, just a big, heavy metal door with a rusted sign on it that said quarantine. Ray looked at me, raising an eyebrow. "You sure we're supposed to be here?" "We've got the keys, don't we?" Though I wasn't so sure myself. The lock clicked open with a loud thunk, and we pushed the door open. The smell hit us first. A thick, musty odor like wet rot mixed with something far worse. I gagged a little, covering my nose. Ray swore under his breath. Inside, the room looked like it hadn't been touched in years. There were old, rusted tables, broken equipment scattered around, and what looked like a few containers of chemicals shoved into the corners. The walls were damp, the paint peeling and cracked, and the floor was slick with something that looked almost like slime. "Let's just get this over with," Ray said, grabbing his mop and bucket. We started cleaning, scrubbing down the walls, wiping off the tables, doing the usual routine. But something about this room felt wrong. The longer we stayed in there, the worse the smell got. It wasn't just mold or rot, it was like something was alive in there, lurking just out of sight. Every time I turned around, I thought I saw movement in the corners of the room, just at the edge of my vision. But when I looked directly at it, there was nothing. As we worked, I noticed a strange, dark patch on one of the walls. It looked like a stain, but it was moving. Not fast, just a slow, crawling kind of movement, like something was spreading. I went over to it, shining my flashlight on it. "What the hell is that?" I asked, calling Ray over. He came up behind me, squinting at the wall. "Looks like mold," he said, poking at it with the end of his mop. The second he touched it, the patch reacted. It pulsed, rippling across the surface of the wall like it was alive. Ray jerked his hand back, startled, but the damage was done. The mold began to spread, fast. It crawled up the walls, across the floor, like a wave of thick black sludge. "Jesus, what the hell is that?" Ray said as he stumbled back. Before we could do anything, the mold surged towards us, tendrils of it creeping across the floors, reaching for our feet. We both scrambled backward, but it was too fast. It latched on the Ray's boot, and he screamed as it started climbing up his leg. I grabbed his arm, trying to pull him free, but the stuff was like glue. And then I watched in horror as the mold melted through his pant leg, sinking into his skin. His flesh bubbled and boiled where it touched him, and the stench of burning meat filled the air. Ray screamed for help, but I didn't know what to do. I yanked at his leg, trying to tear the mold away, but it was like it had become a part of him. His skin was dissolving, melting into the black mass that was quickly consuming his body. The more he struggled, the more it spread. The mold crawled up his chest, wrapping around his arms and his neck. His screams turned into gurgles as the stuff filled his mouth, his nose, suffocating him from the inside. I watched, helpless as the mold swallowed him whole, turning him into a part of itself, part of the growing, living mass that was now spreading across the room. I backed up, trying to keep my distance from the creeping black mold. It wasn't just eating, no. It was growing. Every inch of ray it consumed made it stronger, bigger. The walls were covered in it now, the floor slick with it. It was like the entire room was coming to life, the mold taking over everything in its path. I had to get out. I turned and ran for the door, but the mold was fast. Tendrils of it slithered across the floor, snaking toward me. I dodged, slipping on the slick ground, but I could feel it getting closer, feel the cold, wet touch of it brushing up against my ankles. I reached the door, but the handle was covered in mold too. I hesitated for a second, just long enough for it to catch me. A tendril wrapped around my leg, pulling me down. I fell hard, my head slamming into the concrete floor. Dazed, I tried to crawl, tried to get away, but the mold was everywhere now. It wrapped around my arms, my legs, creeping up my body. I felt it burn as it touched my skin, felt it eat me, piece by piece. My flesh melted, my muscles dissolved in the pain. God, the pain was unbearable. I screamed, but no one could hear me. No one was coming. And then I felt it, deep inside. Something worse than pain. The mold wasn't just eating me. It was changing me. I could feel my body becoming a part of the mass, my mind slipping into the hive of it. I wasn't just dying, I was becoming one of them, a part of the mold, part of its endless hunger. My last thought before I slipped into the darkness was that this place was never supposed to be cleaned. It was a trap, a containment room for something that should have never been disturbed. And now it was free. Free to grow. Free to consume. And free to hunt. The shadows have retreated, for now. But remember, the darkness is never far away. What hides beneath our world waits for the next moment to strike, and the next victim to pull into its cold embrace. Thank you for joining us on Midnight Delight, where the darkness is always just a flicker away. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more chilling tales. Sleep well, if you can.